Hello, Toxic Economic Avengers. Let's do the answers to Portfolio Questionnaire 7. True-false question 1 is this statement. The Keynesian aggregate expenditure model of the economy is primarily focused on explaining inflation. This statement is false. Some economists will present the Keynesian aggregate expenditure model as one in which inflation, in fact, is zero, that prices are stable and don't change, often because they argue that this model is intended to deal with or it assumes a situation in which there is substantial excess capacity in the economy, or in other words, there is mass unemployment and a recession or depression, in which case there is no pressure on prices to rise at all. Other economists say that, well, there's no reason why we can't assume some positive rate of inflation, but it's a stable rate of inflation, whatever it is, say 2% or 3% or 4%, whatever. The key thing is that it's not fluctuating. But whatever position is taken on that, the model is not intended to primarily explain inflation. Rather, its purpose is to explain output. It's an output determination model. And implicitly, it seeks to explain why there could be mass unemployment over some period of time without any fast automatic adjustment process to full employment. If we quickly look at the model, you'll remember from watching the videos, here we've got our Keynesian model, and we can see here that it is in equilibrium. That is, it is producing at an output level, a real GDP level, of 500, and expenditure is similarly 500. Okay. But let's say that the full employment level of real GDP, the level at which GDP would have to be in order for there to be no unemployment, is 900. So we say the economy has excess capacity. So it has unutilized capacity, unemployed workers and factories and land, presumably. And in that case, we've got a recessionary gap. That is, there's, at the full employment level, there would be a gap between expenditure and output. How do we close that recessionary gap? Well, we have to push up the total expenditure in the economy. And remember, total expenditure is composed of these four components: C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and net exports. So we would have to push one or more of those components up, increase them. Now, Keynes argued that we can't rely on consumption expenditure rising in a recessionary environment because households are unlikely to be particularly confident about the future, so they're not going to autonomously increase their consumption spending. And furthermore, consumption spending is partly a function of the level of disposable income available to households. And if that's very low, then there's no incentive to increase it. Investment expenditure, Keynes was sceptical here. He felt that investors couldn't be relied upon to simply act in the interests of the nation and autonomously increase their investment expenditure. And why would they anyway in a recessionary environment? So we can't rely on those guys. Can we expect our export partners to autonomously increase their export expenditure in order to boost our economy? Of course not. That leaves only G, government expenditure. The government has to act autonomously to increase government expenditure in order to shift the overall aggregate expenditure curve or line upwards until we have a new equilibrium here. Okay, but you can see there, and therefore we can close this recessionary gap and eliminate the excess capacity. The economy now would be at equilibrium at full employment. Hooray. But you can see there, everything I just said there did not in any way refer to prices or increases in prices, inflation. Really the purpose is to explain output at a certain level and changes in output, and by implication changes in the level of unemployment. Question 2. True-false. According to the Keynesian aggregate expenditure model of the economy, unemployment is primarily due to excessively high wage rates. This statement is false. As we just saw in the previous diagram, the Keynesian model's explanation of unemployment is insufficient aggregate demand or insufficient aggregate expenditure on goods and services. If aggregate expenditure falls, firms respond by reducing production and laying off workers. In order to employ workers again, you need to increase expenditure in the economy as a whole. Firms will respond to the increased demand for goods and services by increasing production, but in order to do that, they will need to employ more workers. So they will take workers from the pool of unemployed, thereby reducing unemployment. This story does not entail any reference to excessively high wages. So this is false. Question 3. True or false? So-called natural unemployment refers to structural plus frictional unemployment. Well, what are the different types of unemployment we can identify? There's cyclical unemployment, sometimes called Keynesian unemployment, and this is unemployment caused by insufficient expenditure in the economy. There's what's sometimes called classical unemployment, which is caused by the minimum wage being too high. That minimum wage could be a legislated minimum wage, or it could be an effective minimum wage, which is due to the bargaining power of strong unions. Then there's frictional unemployment, because there is not perfect information about all of the jobs that are available to all of the people who are searching for a new job. Then there is friction in leaving one job and finding another. Lucky last, structural unemployment. So this is where someone has skills that are no longer in demand in the economy, in any of the industries in the economy. So this could be because of technological change, for example, within a given industry, so that the skills that a particular worker has become redundant. Or alternatively, it could be that a technological innovation results in the destruction of one kind of industry as a new industry emerges. So, you know, the horse-drawn carriage industry goes down the gurgler as the car industry emerges. So the people who have particular skills in the older dying industry will eventually become unemployed, and they will have skills which are no longer required or in demand in the economy. And so those people will be structurally unemployed. They're unemployed because of the changing structure of the economy. 1 and 2 are often called involuntary unemployment, whereas 3 and 4 are often called voluntary and natural unemployment. So this statement is true. Question 4, true or false? If the multiplier equals 2 and investment spending increases from $50 billion to $60 billion, the multiplier effect will be 20 billion. So investment spending increases by 10 billion, and it is alleged that the multiplier effect, that is the effect, the increase in real GDP as a result, will be 20 billion. So it's very simple in calculating this. The change in real GDP will equal the multiplier, K, times the change in investment spending. So the multiplier is 2 times the change in investment spending is 10. So the change in real GDP is 20. So this statement is true. For more information about the multiplier and the multiplier effect, you should consult the video that I've made about this. Question 5. If wage rates were to rise, the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift upwards, causing cost-push inflation. Here's our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model in the short run. If we have an increase in wage rates, ceteris paribus, that is assuming nothing else is going on, or we could also have, just as a side note, an increase in the price of imported inputs. The way we would represent that is by shifting the aggregate supply curve upwards vertically, indicating that at any given level of output, any given level of real GDP, the price which suppliers would require in order to have an incentive to supply that quantity to the market would have to increase. So we're represented by shifting the aggregate supply curve upwards, like so. In a few textbooks and on some videos that are on YouTube, not by me, they say that the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Now, as far as just drawing the graph in itself, it doesn't really make any difference. Shifting to the left or shifting up is, it's drawing the curve in the same place. But the explanation is different. As I've said, an increase in the wage rate means that the costs to the suppliers increases, and so they would have to shift upwards the prices that they would charge in order to cover those higher costs for the same amount of output, no matter what that output happens to be. So we shift the curve upwards, reflecting the idea that we're increasing the costs of production at any given level of output. Alright, so we've got this increase in the aggregate supply curve, so the economy will now gravitate to the new equilibrium point. So real GDP in this story falls and the general level of prices rises. So we say that inflation has occurred, and that inflation occurred because of the increase in the labour costs, in particular the wage rates. So this is cost push inflation. The statement was true. Question 6. The inverse relation between the price level, the general level of prices, and the aggregate demand expenditure is explained by, so here we're talking about the aggregate demand curve in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So this inverse relationship, so we've got an aggregate demand curve which is downward sloping, and this is explained by the real interest rate effect, the net export effect, the real balance effect, and the doppelganger effect. True or false? So what we're talking about here is what happens if prices were to rise, the general level of prices were to rise, assuming all other things remain equal. Then we would have a movement along the aggregate demand curve, causing real GDP to fall. So this could be caused by the real balances effect, sometimes called a wealth effect, which is due to an increase in prices, makes households feel less wealthy than they did before, and so they decrease their consumption expenditure. They might increase their rates of savings. There's also the interest rate effect. So as prices rise, the demand for money increases in this story. And when the demand for money increases, all other things remaining equal, the price of money rises, just as if the demand for apples were to rise, all other things being equal, then the price of apples would rise. So what's the price of money? It's the price of borrowing money. That is the interest rate. So if interest rates rise, then firms will borrow less than they previously did for investment purposes. So investment expenditure would fall. And then we've got the foreign purchases or net export effect. So when prices rise, this is the prices of domestically produced goods and services, it means that Australia's exports become more expensive, whereas the prices of imported goods don't increase in price. So not only would our exports become less competitive, in the short term anyway, become less competitive, and therefore the quantity of exports purchased would fall. But furthermore, because imported goods which haven't increased in price become more attractive to locals than before, import expenditure rises. In which case, if exports are falling and imports are rising, then you will have less expenditure on net exports, this last component of aggregate demand. So, an increase in price, blah 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 for these three effects, leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of goods and services produced in the country. Notice there is no doppelganger effect in this story, because the doppelganger effect is just a stupid thing that I made up. Question 7. True-false. The long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical at full employment GDP in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. This is true. Here's our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and let's say the economy is in equilibrium at full employment. So Y1 is the full employment level of real GDP. And let's for some reason or other, aggregate demand increases. It means that the economy will shift to an equilibrium point beyond full employment. So when that occurs, this makes the labour market, quote unquote, very tight. Wage rates will rise as a result of this. And we know from the previous question that an increase in the wage rate will lead to a shift upwards in the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve. And that will keep happening while ever the economy is operating beyond the full employment level. So aggregate supply wages keep going up, aggregate supply keeps shifting upwards until we are back to the full employment level of real GDP here. Ta-da! Now, let's ignore the path we went along and just look at our starting point and our end point. If we wanted to, these are our long-run points, our starting point and our end point. So our long-run story is that the aggregate supply in the long run is set at the full employment level. Okay? So the aggregate supply curve is vertical at full employment. Hooray. Question 8. Inflation can benefit borrowers and harm lenders. This is true. Let's take it from the perspective of a lender. And we could be talking about financial institutions here. We could be talking about savers. So if you're saving money, you're lending money. Effectively, you're lending money to the bank, who is going to then, in turn, lend it out to some borrower, a mortgage holder or a business. But we could even keep it simpler than that. Let's say you lend money to your friend. Now let's say you expect the inflation rate is going to be 2% over the course of the year, 2% per annum. So you think to yourself, okay, what I'll do is I'm going to lend you some money, and I'm going to charge you, my friend, in inverted commas, 10% interest per annum on that loan. So at the end of the loan, you will have to pay me back the principal plus 10%. And you do some calculations and you figure out that means that the real interest rate that I am charging my friend is 8%. real interest rate here means this is giving us our real return on our loan to our friend, because we're going to be getting back 10% extra money, but everything is going to cost 2% more than previously, than at the beginning of the year. So in real terms, I've made a profit of a return of 8%. I can buy 8% more stuff than at the beginning of the year. But what if, after you've done these calculations, it turns out that the actual inflation rate for the year, unbeknownst to you, unanticipated by you, is 10%? What will be your real rate of interest now? What will be your real return on your loan? Well, you'll get 10% back in extra money, but everything you want to buy at the end of the year is now going to cost 10% more. In which case, the real return on your loan is 0%. You're actually no better off as a lender. So, does the inflation harm the lender? Yes. But bear in mind here, it harms the lender by virtue of it being unanticipated. By you not being able to... you didn't factor in what was actually going to be the inflation rate into your calculations because you didn't see it coming. So unanticipated inflation harms lenders. And you can tell the same story about borrowers, except it's beneficial to the borrower. The borrower, in real terms, they thought they were going to have to pay 8% interest in real terms. But in fact, they end up paying 0% interest in real terms. So the borrower actually benefits in that case. Question 9. In the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the aggregate demand curve will shift right if there is an exogenous increase in consumption spending, government spending, investment spending, or net exports. This is true. Exogenous here means a change in C or G or I or NX that is independent of prices, or the inflation rate, and of the prevailing level of income in the economy, the current level of income in the economy. So consumption expenditure, for example, increases because consumers become more confident about the future, say. So they're willing to spend more of their income and save less of it. Or investors might become very confident about the future. Right? Their animal spirits get elevated and they become very optimistic, and so they decide we're going to invest a lot more now than previously because we think the future looks particularly rosy. Or it could be due to an improvement in the economic environment in our major trading partners. So there's an increase in exports that has nothing to do with our economy that causes overall, assuming a lot of things remain equal, net exports to rise. Or the government may decide to increase government expenditure. It might be for political reasons. So they might be nefarious political reasons. So there's an election coming up and they've decided to spend a whole bunch of its accumulated budget surplus on some kind of idiotic white elephant, like a stadium or something stupid like that. Or it might be for good moral reasons, that there is significant unemployment or there is mass homelessness or something like that. In any case, it would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So what we mean here is that at any given price level, say P1, A shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right would increase real GDP. If the price were higher, then real GDP will increase. If the price were lower, then real GDP would increase. Okay, but it's caused by any one of these changing independently of price and independently of real GDP too. This is going to be an effect, not a cause. Question 10, true false. John Maynard Keynes was born in the 19th century. A Google search will solve this problem for you. Keynes was born on the 5th of June in 1883. There's a picture of Keynes. Well, that's him on the left there. In 1900, at 17 years old. So, if he wasn't born in the 19th century, somehow he's acquired the powers of time travel. Anyway, so it's true. He was born in the 19th century. Okie doke. See you later.
Meet little Melvin. He's a 90-pound weakling. Everyone hated Melvin.
I'm gonna take this mop and shove it down your throat.
They teased him.
I want to do it with you. Okay.
They taunted him. They tormented him until he had a horrifying accident and fell into a vat of nuclear waste. Transforming little Melvin into a hideously deformed creature of superhuman size and strength. Melvin became the Toxic Avenger. The first superhero born out of nuclear waste. Yes, the muggers and the rapists didn't know what law and order was until the Toxic Avenger came to town.
Holy shit! I don't know what it was, but it saved my life. All right, everybody, drop your tacos or I'll blow your brains out.
The vandals and the perverts had their way with the little people of Tromaville until the Toxic Avenger ripped them apart. The Toxic Avenger. His face is so terrifying. We can't show it to you now. You'll have to see the movie for yourself. The Toxic Avenger can bend steel with his bare hands.
Oh, we're on a kid. Get it?
Leap small cars in a single bound. He crushes drug pushers. Smashes hit-and-run drivers. And gives all criminals their just desserts. The Toxic Avenger.
He was a hero.
He's a hero.
Wow.
He's a fighter. He's a lover.
Oh, Melvin, you're beautiful.
The good citizens love him. The fat and corrupt hate him.
Kill that bastard for me. You gotta kill him.
Yeah.
Will he survive? For incredible, explosive action, you must see the Toxic Avenger. He's a different kind of hero. The Toxic Avenger is coming to your town. Look out.